There's no such thing as an anti-war film. Now, this has been a controversial statement for decades. It's controversial for a reason, because though initially it seems wrong because of course there is, it has merit. Apocalypse Now has been called an anti-war film and one of the best for decades. But despite this, Coppola himself believes the film isn't inherently anti-war. He argues that no one wants to make a pro-war film. Everyone wants to make an anti-war film. But an anti-war film, I always thought, should be like the Burmese harp. Something filled with love and peace and tranquility and happiness. It shouldn't have sequences of violence that inspire a lust for violence. Apocalypse Now has stirring scenes of helicopters attacking innocent people. That's not anti-war. And he isn't really wrong. See, the problem is that war films have a tendency to have a sense of camaraderie, stories of overcoming adversity, cool shots of battles, and compelling sequences of terror. But all of these things can't help but push the narrative of war requires heroes, and there will always be people who have that complex, who believe they need to be heroes. But despite this, you can never help how people will interpret your film, your art, your work. You can misconstrue everything, and people often do. So though these are valid points, I think this film is at its core anti-war. A release represents the void of purpose and, as you already read, the emptiness and futility of war. So I watched the Apocalypse Now final cut and it just hit me in a way that it never did before. This was my first viewing of the final cut version and maybe that's the difference. But it's brilliant from the very opening sequence, which is soundtracked by The End from The Doors, which is a song, like Apocalypse Now, has been debated forever about because of its real meaning. People speculate it's about a breakup, some speculate it's about Vietnam itself and the decline of civilization, and some think it's simply about the theme of death overall. The meaning and theme of it can be debated, but what I think is most interesting is that a song called The End is what opens the whole film, as if to say it was over before it even began. Also, did you know that this whole opening was made up of scrapped footage from the napalm scenes later on in the film, which I suppose is made less impressive by the fact that Coppola ended up shooting 1.5 million feet of film for this movie, which is insane. But in the end, it makes sense because Coppola had a lot invested in this movie. Literally, he put forward 30 million of his own money to get the budget he needed for it, even though he went over budget and over schedule anyway. He even put up his own house and winery as collateral to the bank. And every time a director does this, you know something special is about to happen, like M. Night Shyamalan did for Split. But what's interesting is that Coppola wasn't even supposed to direct this initially. Originally, a little-known filmmaker named George Lucas was originally supposed to direct, but eventually dropped out to go and do a small independent film called Star Wars. But funnily enough, Harrison Ford was brought over to play Colonel Lucas, which was a nod to George, and made even funnier by the fact that he went on to star in Star Wars as Han Solo. He was also previously in Lucas's American Graffiti, so I suppose he was a leftover from George when he was handling the project. But he's a spark of a bigger talking point of this film. See, the cast of this film is perfect, down to the very last extra. Obviously, Martin Sheen is brilliant, Marlon Brando is an ingenious pick even though he was initially hesitant to take the role, but for me, the biggest standout is Lawrence Fishburne, who was only 14 at the time filming began. And the big practical sets and effects sell the war perfectly and look insanely cool whilst being equally impressive. But this is all a little off track because this is all just simply the cosmetics. Yes, it's all interesting and impressive, but what sells the theme of the emptiness and futility of war isn't the cast. Not truly. It isn't the sets. Not truly. It's the characters and their individual stories. Take Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore, for example. He's the portrayal of how truly insane and emotionally unstable one has to be to confidently lead a platoon of men in a war such as this. He almost loves war. He definitely loves being a soldier, and his being informs our protagonist Willard of the hypocrisy of the government and military, because Willard is just an audience surrogate. He's exploring and learning same as us. He doesn't have an individual journey, at least one that the audience doesn't take and have with him. But Kilgore is just a roadblock, just a little stop on the way, of which there are tons of, but he's one of the most interesting because it's the initial tip-off of what's to come. See, Willard is sent on a mission to kill Kurtz, a colonel gone rogue in the Vietnamese jungle and essentially started a cult. They claim the reason they need to relieve him of his command is that he's gone insane, he's lost his mind, but Kilgore doesn't seem any more insane than Kurtz supposedly is. If they consider Kilgore sane, what is Kurtz doing? What are they hiding? What's the ulterior motive if there is one? This first hint of hypocrisy, or at least doubt in the military's plan and transparency, is one of the first big indicators of this emptiness, of the futility of it all. Over time they build this suspicion of why they really want Kurtz dead perfectly. He seems to be a hero, but he also seems to be aware of something they don't want him to be. He seems to have made moves that didn't make sense, that took more than guts, more than insanity. But before we get to Kurtz entirely, they continue to explore the themes of emptiness and futility more, namely when they keep finding these outposts where they periodically take breaks. There's one scene where they fly in some Playboy models to do a little show for the men, and it's funny how they show this. It's like women turn into Michael Jackson in his prime, people crawling over barbed wire, screaming, fighting with each other over them. The reality is, all this is in the effort of chasing home, or the feeling of normality. See, the Viet Cong are fighting for their homes and the American soldiers are fighting to go home. It highlights the senselessness of it all. But regardless, we continue moving and we finally get to this bridge, which is a signifier that they're closing in on their journey's end, and this place just looks post-apocalyptic. And this is where Willard finds out that there is no CEO of this station, and it becomes really apparent that that sentiment is really representative of this whole operation, of this whole military force. Nobody is ever really in charge of anything. Kilgore was in charge of his operation, but it didn't seem he was really in charge when it came to Willard and his men, even though they came under the umbrella of his men for that mission. And though Willard is on his own mission, Chief was in charge of the boat and they constantly fight over command of the men aboard. Every time they reach an outpost, it just feels like everyone is playing it by ear. There is no organization, there is no chain of command. It is just men trying their hardest to string together a unified front against a threat they have no hope to beat and equally have no reason to. We're all aware by now that the Vietnam War is one of the most brutal yet futile wars of all time, and that is completely summarized by the conversation at the French plantation. This scene was originally taken out of the film in the theatrical version, and I can see why. I've seen people say it kills the momentum and it ruins all the tension previously built, which I totally understand, but respectfully I disagree. This scene puts on the table the futility more than anything else in the film. It displays the French involvement with colonialism that played its part in the Vietnam War, which is an often overlooked aspect of it, whilst giving the Americans time to discuss the politics of the war with outsiders that have more perspective without bias. They explain that the French are here, or more specifically themselves, because of their long history of losing and surrendering. They're sticking on their land because they feel they have to. They have something to gain, or at least they have something to lose. But they say something that I think is the crux of this whole video.
Well, you are American. You are fighting for the biggest nothing in history.
This works on so many levels, but especially with Willard's personal journey, because yes, this is expressive of the whole war, but Willard's mission became more and more irrational and not worth it. It became a more personal mission to complete. It became less about killing Kurtz and more about confronting him. He had become so invested in this futile mission that he had to see it through regardless of the outcome. Which brings us back to Kurtz. We finally get introduced to him, and first of all, he's shot like a fucking horror villain, like the boogeyman, which is honestly deserved. We experience so much atrocity in this war, and yet the biggest looming threat over the whole film is Kurtz. We build so much mythos around him that finally seeing him feels honestly surreal. He gives Willard this speech about the worst things he's ever seen and done, but he tells one particular story about children's arms being cut off and how much it horrified him, but also in some sadistic way impressed him, inspired him even. He says the line, "It's judgment that defeats us." trying to say that the Viet Cong are destined to win because of their ability to become morally absent on their journey to victory. They're a united force that operate under the same beliefs, but the Americans are a disorganized group out of their depth using soldiers with no real stake in the war because they're fighting for something they don't even believe in. He's an interesting antagonist because he's essentially personifying what it is to win a war, what it is to believe in fighting one. He deifies himself, he loses compassion, he joins the side he believes will win, and it's an interesting set of parallels as he's no different to the politicians except he's there and they're not. He becomes a threat because he's operating under the same initiative they are, but unlike them, he's there and that makes all the difference. He becomes a threat through using their ideals and methods, and that is ultimately the emptiness and futility of war. Because men are just fighting on behalf of suits who don't care about them. They just care about the political implications of a win or lose. It's the poor fighting over the grievances of rich men. So this film originally had a different ending wherein Willard and Kurtz die in a gun-blazing battle where the camp gets destroyed in a huge inferno, but Coppola changed the ending through filming since it didn't match the film he was making, and I agree. Willard discovers what we've discussed, and to do it in this way and to end the film this way would be to undercut every lesson learned. So the ending we have is that Willard assassinates Kurtz and his last words are, "the horror," which echoes throughout the fading frames, and it's perfect. It's perfect since that's all that's left with you after this film, it's all you've experienced, but it's also Kurtz's last realization of himself, what he's done, what others are capable of, what civilians will never understand, and what war ultimately is. A horror fueled by empty and futile motives. So have you seen Apocalypse Now? If so, let me know what you think. Let me know what you think of this video and the topic discussed. I read every single comment and reply to as many as possible, and whether it's this masterpiece from Francis Ford Coppola or not, as always, keep watching movies.